All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going way beyond just, stepping into the ring. We're diving deep, really deep into the cultural history of boxing.
Right.
You sent in boxing, a cultural history, and what might seem at first like just a sport actually has incredible depth. I mean, it touches on everything from ancient rituals to modern identity.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive.
Our mission today is to really try to pull out those fascinating insights, like how boxing has mirrored and shaped, even shaped societal values, conflicts, artistic expressions throughout history. And the stuff you've given us here is so rich. We've got academic analysis, literature, art, personal stories. It's all in here.
Yeah, it's a fascinating mix.
So let's jump in. Where does this story even begin?
Well, what's really fascinating is that boxing's origins actually stretch way back, much earlier than many people realize.
Okay, so not just the Greeks and Romans.
Not at all. While ancient Greece, often comes to mind, we've got evidence that activities resembling boxing were recorded in Egypt and Mesopotamia as far back as the 3rd millennium BC.
Wow, that's ancient.
It is. So the key insight here is that this impulse for physical contest, this kind of physical contest, is really deeply rooted in human history.
Really deep. Wow. So what did these early forms of boxing look like?
The depictions from the late Bronze Age, around 1600 to 1200 BC,
Mhm.
across the Eastern Mediterranean are particularly interesting. We see images of pugilists, some are a bit rough,
Sure.
like those on a Mycenaean pot from Cyprus. But then we see others, like a fresco of what they call the Boxing Boys from Thera, an ancient Minoan settlement. Those are incredibly detailed and remarkably sophisticated.
So even back then, they had some pretty good artists.
They did. And what's even more striking is that even these ancient figures, they're adopting stances that look very similar to those that we see in Greek vase paintings like 1,000 years later.
Huh.
So the real impact here is this, this visual continuity of fighting techniques across millennia.
That's a fascinating visual connection. And then, of course, we get to Homer, the foundation of so much of Western literature. Boxing features prominently in the Iliad and the Odyssey, right?
Absolutely. In the 8th century BC, these epics describe, athletic games and competitions. And one match, the match between Epeos and Euryalus in the Iliad, is particularly interesting.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. What makes that specific match so symbolic?
Several things, actually. First, Homer really highlights the contrast between Epeos, who is quite boastful, and Euryalus, who's, relatively modest.
Right.
But more importantly, the fight actually illustrates what we might call deep play.
Deep play.
Deep play. So deep play refers to these ritualized or symbolic actions, that have significant social or cultural meaning beyond their immediate function.
Okay.
So in this case, it's symbolic violence that actually quarantines real violence. Epeos makes these bloody threats, right? But after knocking Euryalus out, and Homer doesn't shy away from the physicality, the violence, he lifts his opponent to his feet.
So even in these ancient stories, there's a sense of sportsmanship.
There is. So the key insight here is that even back then, ancient societies recognized this need for controlled outlets for aggression. Right.
I guess it makes sense.
They used ritualized violence, basically, as a way to manage real conflict.
To channel it. So it's a way for society to engage with aggression in a controlled environment. Now, the source material also mentions these analogies between boxing and warfare in these early texts.
Yes, absolutely. Both Homer and Virgil draw these direct comparisons. And it's not necessarily that skill in one automatically translates to the other,
Sure.
but that the activities themselves are seen as kind of analogous in terms of the mindset and attributes that are required.
I can see that.
In the Iliad, Epeos actually says, and this is a great quote, he says, "Is it not enough that I am less good in battle? A man cannot be expert in all things."
Wow. Yeah, great quote.
Right. And Achilles, though he is a superior warrior, he shares that kind of unwavering self-belief. And later you see this in the Aeneid. The fight between Dares and Entellus, that kind of foreshadows the decisive struggle between Turnus and Aeneas.
So there's a narrative parallel there.
Exactly. So what's really impactful is how these physical contests are seen as kind of reflections or even training grounds in a metaphorical sense for the skills and the mindset needed in war.
So it's like these contests are a way to prepare for the real thing.
Yeah, in a way.
And Plato takes this even further, doesn't he?
He does. Plato, in several of his dialogues set in gymnasia and palaestrae, which were ancient Greek wrestling schools. He really explores this connection. In Laws, he argues for the necessity of training soldiers, and he compares them to boxers preparing for a fight.
Okay, so soldiers training like athletes.
Exactly. And he even poses this question, would we send boxers into the ring unprepared? And similarly, in the Republic, he suggests that a well-trained Athens could actually stand against wealthier and more powerful enemies, just as a skilled boxer can defeat multiple untrained opponents.
Interesting.
So he's drawing this direct analogy between individual skill and, national strength.
That's interesting.
And he even likens Socratic debate to a boxing match in the Protagoras with all the strategic moves and countermoves. So the key insight here is how deeply embedded this metaphor of boxing was in ancient Greek thought, extending, from physical training to intellectual sparring.
So from physical training for war to intellectual sparring, the metaphor of boxing is all over the place. Okay, so we've seen these ancient roots. How does this then evolve into the prize fighting scene in 18th century England?
The source material highlights a real transition in 18th century England. It's when boxing started to really flourish, and notably at the expense of other popular sports at the time.
So boxing was becoming the main event.
It was. And this boxing rise, was significantly fueled by the support of the wealthy and powerful, including figures like King George III and the Duke of Cumberland.
As always, it seems like patronage plays a big role in these kinds of developments. What was the nature of their support? Did they just like watching fights?
Well, they did like watching fights. They would support their fighters in training, and crucially, they wagered huge sums on their fights.
As you do, high rollers.
They were. The source actually quotes the Gentleman's Magazine, reporting that many thousands depended on the outcome of a single bout.
That's serious money.
It was. The author even suggests that without this 18th century love of gambling, pugilism as it developed might have been, quote, unthinkable.
Huh. So boxing as we know it wouldn't exist without gambling.
It's possible. So what's really impactful here is how this economic element of wagering directly shaped the growth and structure of early professional boxing.
And with high stakes like that, you'd imagine disputes would be pretty common. That's where rules come in, right?
Exactly. So the need to limit disputes that arose from these large wagers that actually led to the first written rules of prize fighting. These were published in 1743 under John Broughton's name.
Makes sense.
It's fascinating to kind of connect this to the broader Enlightenment project of systemization and lawmaking.
Okay, yeah.
Even something as seemingly visceral as boxing became subject to this codification.
Interesting.
And the impact of this, codification on the sport's development was really significant. It provided a framework for fair play, at least in theory, and helped to professionalize the activity.
So it's like trying to bring order to chaos, even within this realm of physical combat. And how was boxing viewed at this time? Was it just seen as, a brutal spectacle?
Not entirely, no. There was this contemporary view of English boxing as a noble art and a science.
Noble art and a science.
Yes.
Yeah.
Figures like James Figg and John Broughton, who ran these prominent boxing schools, which were even described as amphitheaters, they deliberately tried to evoke classical ideals. Figg was even depicted in a portrait as the gladiator et vivum. And travelers on the Grand Tour started collecting classical sculptures of boxers. And these sculptures were then studied by modern artists.
So they were trying to connect the past with the present.
Exactly. There was a real attempt to link English pugilism to this glorious athletic past. So the key insight here is this conscious effort to elevate the status of boxing by associating it with the prestige of classical antiquity.
So a conscious effort to elevate its status, but I'm guessing not everyone bought into this romanticized view.
You're right. The source material points out this shift in perception, and you start seeing satirical views emerging in publications like Mr. Town,
Okay.
which in 1754 joked that after Bratton's defeat, the, quote, professors of the noble art of boxing would become a kind of disbanded army turning to crime. And Oliver Goldsmith, in The Vicar of Wakefield, portrays this rakish young squire, Thornhill, as a corrupting influence who encourages, get this, he encourages young boys to box to make them sharp, highlighting boxing as this empty indulgence of wealthy Londoners. So while there was this attempt to elevate boxing to a noble art, this view wasn't universally held as we see in these emerging satirical perspectives.
So this idea that boxing was this classless mark of an honest man that wasn't universally accepted. And what about Hogarth, who we know had a keen eye for English society? What did he make of all this?
Hogarth's view, too, evolved over time. Initially, he might have seen boxing as just another, manifestation of exuberant Englishness.
Right.
But by 1751, his series, The Four Stages of Cruelty, that aligns boxing with, with cruelty, with the cruelties of cockfighting, execution, and dissection.
Wow, that's a shift.
He even includes an advertisement for a match at Broughton's Amphitheatre in the second print. And he actually names James Field, a boxer who was later hanged for robbery, in the final print that depicts the dissection of a criminal's body.
Huh.
So for Hogarth, boxing had clearly taken on this darker, meaning, moving from like national exuberance to something associated with societal cruelty.
That's a pretty big change.
It is. It highlights how the cultural perception of boxing could shift so dramatically within a relatively short period.
It's fascinating how something can go from being celebrated to condemned. Okay, let's move into the Georgian and Regency eras. We see the rise of nationalism, really taking hold. How does boxing tie into that?
In the 1780s, you see a revival of boxing, again with this aristocratic interest. And this was partly fueled by boxing's association with English courage, particularly during the looming war with France.
Oh, interesting.
The highly publicized fights between Richard Humphreys and Daniel Mendoza, those really captured the public
The
imagination.
big names.
They were. And Mendoza's memoirs, which were published in 1816, likely ghostwritten, provided this, vivid picture of both prize fighting and London life at the time.
Okay.
So the key insight here is how boxing became intertwined with this sense of national pride and identity during a period of conflict and potential war.
So boxing as a symbol of national identity.
Exactly. There was this growing rhetoric of nationalist masculinity.
Hmm.
This specter of effeminacy was constantly evoked.
Right.
And boxing, with its very direct physicality, was presented as this more masculine, inherently English way of fighting compared to, foreign methods like using daggers and knives. This is even mentioned in popular songs at the time.
Oh, wow. So it's literally being written into the culture.
It was.
Hmm.
And William Cobbett, a friend of William Wyndham, he even wrote a defense of boxing, explicitly linking it to the prevention of, quote, national degradation and submission to foreign powers.
Wow.
He contrasted it with, and this is a list, commerce, opulence, luxury, effeminacy, cowardice, slavery,
So if you didn't like boxing, you were practically un-English.
and potentially a coward.
Yeah.
Right? It was powerful rhetoric.
It was. So this growing sense of national identity and interest in these masculine ideals that also manifested in the popular language of the time, leading to what was known as flash.
Yes, flash.
So the source says flash was essentially the slang or argot of the sporting world and wider society in the 1820s.
Right.
What was so significant about its use?
Its significance lies in how pervasive it became, particularly in the literature and magazines of the time. Thomas de Quincey, for instance, he cleverly used boxing slang in a critique of phrenology, which is the pseudoscience of skull measurement.
Okay.
This was in 1828. He drew these parallels between the interest in the human skull in both fields. He even championed the philosopher Sir William Hamilton, describing him as no shy fighter.
Okay.
And he noted how the, quote, chanceried knobs of his philosophical opponents show proof of his pugilistic prowess.
Wow. So he's using these terms metaphorically.
He is. This really demonstrates how the language of boxing had, permeated wider culture.
Right.
It could be used for this metaphorical and humorous effect in some very unexpected contexts.
That's a really vivid and unexpected application of boxing terminology. And what about Hazlitt? He had such interesting takes on art and culture. What did he make of boxing?
Well, Hazlitt was a big admirer of Hogarth, and he saw in Hogarth's work, as well as in the Elgin marbles, which are those sculptures from the Parthenon, he saw a focus on matter as it is. He was rejecting these idealized forms and defining beauty in these, democratic and empirical terms.
Okay.
And he drew this parallel between this direct representation of reality and the harmonious, flowing, varied prose of essayists.
Interesting.
And for Hazlitt, sports fans had as discerning an eye for beauty in their own way as sculptors or anatomists.
So he's saying there's an art to appreciating even something as kind of rough as boxing.
Right, exactly. He actually quotes Hogarth, who wrote that the eye alone must determine us in our choice of what is most pleasing to itself.
There you go.
So the key insight here is how even the appreciation of beauty could be framed through this lens of a sporting sensibility, emphasizing directness, and empirical observation.
So even the appreciation of beauty could be seen through the lens of a sporting sensibility. And the identities of the boxers themselves, were they just kind of these anonymous brawlers? Or did they have, individual stories?
Oh, they definitely had individual stories. The source material actually gives us these fascinating glimpses into their identities. There's some speculation that the model for classical sculpture was actually a 19th century Jewish man from the East End of London.
Oh, wow. So a real person behind the art.
And then you have Sir Thomas Lawrence's portraits of his friend, John Jackson. Those are even more intriguing. One early portrait depicted Jackson as, get this, Satan summoning his legions. It was this larger-than-life portrayal playing on an obvious boxing pun about being knocked down and having to get up. But the face in the portrait was actually that of the actor, John Kemble.
Oh, interesting.
And Jackson's body was also used for an 1800 painting of Rolla. These examples show how boxers could be both celebrated for their physicality and used as these, symbolic figures in art, reflecting diverse social identities.
That's quite a range of representations. Okay, let's move into the Victorian era. How does boxing feature in the literature and art of this period?
Well, we see a significant influence coming from Pierce Egan's life in London. The source suggests that John Clare, during his time in the Northampton Asylum, may have even modeled his own, quote, metropolitan tourist programs on the, quote, sprees and larks of Egan's fictional heroes.
Interesting.
So Clare adopted these pseudonyms and alter egos, including those of prizefighters he had seen, like Jones the Sailor Boy and Tom Spring. He even referred to himself as, quote, Boxer Byron made of iron. It seems that this persona of the pugilist became this, this stance of defiance for Clare within the violent atmosphere of the asylum.
So a literary figure finding strength in the identity of a fighter, amidst his own personal turmoil.
Exactly. This is a powerful example of how the image of the boxer could provide this framework for self-expression and even resistance, in these unexpected circumstances.
It's powerful how these figures can resonate across different contexts. What about Dickens, who captured so many facets of Victorian life?
Dickens' portrayal of boxing is really complex. George Orwell argued that Dickens, had little interest in pugilism and depicted surprisingly little physical brutality. However, others, like John Carey, they contend that violence, including, quote, socks on the jaw, was actually a powerful stimulant to Dickens' imagination.
Interesting.
The source suggests that the shifting cultural meanings of boxing in the Victorian era are well reflected in his work. For instance, in Great Expectations, Pip has this fight with a pale young gentleman.
Right.
And the source analyzes this scene as a counteraction to Estella's, humiliating behavior, with Dickens using this sophistic phraseology to critique social hypocrisy.
Okay.
So Dickens wasn't just describing a fight, right?
Why?
He was using the language and the imagery of boxing to actually comment on these social dynamics and power imbalances.
So Dickens wasn't just describing fights, he was using them as a way to comment on these broader societal issues. And during this period, we also see this contrast in how boxing was viewed in different educational settings, right?
Yes, absolutely. There's this notable contrast between the what they call muscular Christianity ideal.
Okay.
This was promoted in public schools and universities. You see it exemplified in Tom Brown's School Days, which advocated for this development of Christian character through physical activity, including sports like boxing. And then you have Walter Pater's, more aesthetic celebration of the Hellenic ideal of the male body in peaceful combat as a fine art, evident in these, Greek sculptures of athletes. Peter really focused on this fleeting moment of poised beauty, almost purged of the, quote, angry blood-like stains of action and passion.
Okay.
So one emphasized moral virtue through physicality, while the other focused on the aesthetic form and its connection to classical ideals.
So a difference in emphasis, a different kind of ideal being promoted. What about the representation of women in relation to boxing during this time?
Well, the source actually points to these contrasting representations. Punch cartoons, for example. They often presented women's boxing as a joke, showing men, quote, initiating women into boxing.
Right.
And these images of mothers handing their babies to these, burly boxing tutors.
Okay.
However, there are also more serious, though often still stereotypical, stories of women fighting over men, quote, according to pugilistic rules. And the athletic new woman also featured in early visual technologies with, attention often focused on their costumes and what they revealed. This really highlights the shifting and often contradictory views on women's participation in physical activity during the Victorian era.
So you have this mix of comedic dismissal and perhaps a nascent interest in female athleticism, but, often presented through a male gaze.
Right.
And we also see boxing influencing female authors like George Eliot.
Absolutely. In The Mill on the Floss, George Eliot actually portrays Tom Tulliver's masculine philosophy as being based on strength and pugnacity.
Okay.
So his love of fighting stories and his belief in this boy's justice of the fist, while presented as a form of honor, is ultimately shown to be limited.
Yeah.
Even after learning Greek verbs, he remains, in Eliot's words, an excellent bovine lad in his moral understanding.
So physical strength is not necessarily equated with true moral development.
Right.
And even Sherlock Holmes, surprisingly, had a connection to boxing.
He did. Holmes tells Watson that, quote, "If all else fails me, I have still one of the scientific professions open to me."
Really?
He's relying on the fact that both pugilism and detection were deemed scientific at the time.
Huh?
And this isn't just a coincidence of terminology. Both boxing and detection, they require this, careful application of method and technique to an often elusive opponent. And both are depicted as, kind of solitary pursuits.
That's an interesting connection.
Holmes actually mentions in his memoirs that, barring fencing and boxing, he had few athletic traits and was, quote, "always rather fond of moping in my rooms and working out my own little methods of thought."
So for Holmes, boxing was a thinking man's pursuit.
In a way, yes. It was an amateur pursuit dependent on both, quote, "little methods of thought" and chivalric intentions. Though by the 1890s, the sport was increasingly becoming a business.
Okay.
So this highlights the evolving perception of boxing, moving from a gentlemanly pursuit to a more commercialized profession.
So the scientific aspect of boxing and detection is a fascinating link between these, seemingly very different fields.
It is.
Okay, let's move into the early 20th century and the impact of modernity on boxing.
So the early 20th century saw this real growth in boxing clubs.
Okay.
And their appeal was broad, They were attracting both criminals and middle-class men, seeking what was termed the strenuous life. This was advocated by figures like Jack London and psychologist G. Stanley Hall, who even admitted a, quote, "compulsive interest in the raw side of human life" and secretly attended prize fights.
Wow.
And then you have the artist Thomas Eakins, who openly explored prize fights in his work.
No.
But, interestingly, he didn't focus on the action in the ring.
No.
He focused on the surrounding professional activities, the attendants, the referee, the press, the police, and he saw in these scenes a modern American heroism.
So the focus of the art was shifting away from this, romanticism of the fight itself to these more mundane, almost realities of its professional context.
That's right.
And Jack London himself, a keen observer of masculinity, what were his thoughts on boxing?
Well, London's approach was initially more romantic. In his story, A Piece of Steak, he describes his aging boxer protagonist as going out into the night, quote, "to get meat for his mate and cubs, not like the modern working man going to his machine grind, but in the old, primitive, royal animal way by fighting for it."
Okay.
And he often contrasted, the drudgery of factory work with this, quote, "old, primitive way of earning a living."
Interesting.
However, in The Somnambulists, London critiques the hypocrisy of a meat manufacturer who's disgusted by prize fighters, but simultaneously fails to protect his own factory workers from dangerous machinery.
Okay.
He even suggests that a punch to the face from an honest boxer was preferable to the dangers of industrial labor.
Huh. So London is really using boxing as a way to critique industrial society.
He is. It highlights his complex view of boxing, seeing it both as this vestige of a more primal existence, and as this stark contrast to the dehumanizing aspects of modern industrial life.
It's a powerful critique of industrial dehumanization, using this image of the boxer.
Right.
And what about the new medium of film? How did early cinema portray boxing?
Or early films, like those featuring gentleman Jim Corbett, those often showcased actual fights or staged exhibitions.
Okay.
But then you have Charlie Chaplin, who offered this, comedic debunking of the masculine and nativist posturing around boxing in films like The Champion and City Lights.
Okay.
In these films, the tramp, Chaplin's character, only resorts to boxing out of necessity. And he often, like, comically undermines the expected displays of strength and aggression.
Oh, I can see that.
Like, for example, in City Lights, he minces and flirts with this much larger opponent, and it ends up unnerving him more than any punch.
Classic Chaplin.
Chaplin, despite being a fan of boxing, he used his films to subvert this macho image often associated with it, finding this humor in the gap between expectation and reality.
Chaplin always had a knack for finding humor in these serious situations. And what about the representation of women in boxing during this early 20th century period?
Well, the source suggests that representations were still pretty limited and often stereotypical. They often reverted to these scantily clad figures reminiscent of earlier periods.
Okay.
While some women were, declared champion female boxer of America or world female champion, these titles weren't really taken very seriously.
Right.
More popular were stories of women fighting over men or against unwanted advances, usually framed within, quote, pugilistic rules.
Yeah.
So this reveals this limited space and these, often objectified portrayals of women in a sport so heavily associated with traditional masculinity.
So still largely viewed through this lens of novelty or traditional gender roles. And we also see boxing becoming this, marker of assimilation for immigrant communities, particularly Jewish immigrants.
Yes. In Abraham Kenhan's 1896 novella Jekyll, A Tale of the New York Ghetto, the protagonist's transformation into the, quote, American feller, a Yankee, is directly linked to his enthusiasm for dance halls and boxing.
Interesting.
He proudly displays his grasp of boxing terminology to his fellow sweatshop workers, seeing it as a sign of his Americanization.
Okay.
However, the source also notes that boxing promoters often exploited ethnic animosities
Oh.
by matching fighters of different backgrounds against each other.
Ah, I see.
So while boxing could be a path to embracing a new identity, it could also be used to reinforce existing social divisions for commercial gain.
A double-edged sword, a
Right.
path to assimilation, but also a source of potential division. And then we come to Jack Johnson, this pivotal figure in the history of boxing and race relations.
Absolutely. Jack Johnson, as an early 20th century black heavyweight champion, held immense symbolic importance in the context of racial equality. The source actually highlights how he ended up being named alongside Civil War liberators in a list of important figures for African Americans, really underscoring his significance.
Wow.
Despite facing, constant racial prejudice and having difficulty securing title fights, Johnson's victory over Tommy Burns in 1908 made him the first black heavyweight champion. And this sparked this significant white backlash and this desperate search for a great white hope to defeat him.
The Great White Hope era, a really shameful period, reflecting the deep-seated racism of the time. How did the black community react to Johnson's success?
Well, for black Americans, Johnson was this symbol of defiance, a direct challenge to white supremacy.
Okay.
His success coincided with the emergence of what was called the New Negro movement, characterized by this renewed willingness of black Americans to, quote, strike back against oppression.
A new era of activism.
Exactly. Johnson's flamboyant lifestyle and his refusal to conform to these racial stereotypes that further fueled white animosity but really solidified his status as a hero within the black community.
Makes sense.
He was seen as embodying this new assertiveness, a rejection of the, quote, timorous, docile Negro of the past.
Huh.
What's really impactful here is how Johnson's achievements in the ring became this incredibly powerful form of symbolic resistance against this systemic racism.
A truly transformative figure whose impact really went far beyond the boxing ring. Okay, let's move into the interwar period. How did literature, art, and politics continue to engage with boxing during this time?
Well, we see a range of perspectives during this period. Ernest Hemingway, despite being a fan of Gene Tunney and critical of Jack Dempsey, he used boxing in his writing in these really complex ways.
Okay.
In his 1926 Banal Story, he satirizes these intellectual magazines by presenting this series of seemingly shallow questions, including one about, reconciling boxers and cultured figures.
Okay.
However, the embedded story of a bullfighter's death, which is told with this, precise detail and this lack of abstraction, highlights Hemingway's own belief in this connection between physical prowess and authentic expression. And in The Sun Also Rises, the suggestion that Jake Barnes wants to fight Mike Campbell. That kind of underscores these underlying tensions and these unspoken desires between men, with a boxing match serving as a potential, albeit unrealized, outlet for these emotions.
So boxing is a way to explore, these unspoken tensions between men.
Right. So for Hemingway, boxing provided this rich terrain for exploring themes of masculinity, authenticity, and this, unspoken conflict.
So boxing could be both a subject of satire for Hemingway and this lens through which to explore these deeper human emotions.
Exactly.
And what about the artistic movements of the time? How did they engage with boxing?
Well, for avant-garde movements like Dada and Surrealism, boxing imagery became a way to express rebellion in this dialectical tension.
Okay.
Paul Dermet, for example, he presented boxing without tears at a Dada festival. And Jacques Rigaud's, surrealist autobiography includes this violent American right hook as an act of defiance.
Huh.
And Picabia and René Clair's film Entr'acte opens with these boxing gloves punching each other, suggesting this dialectical engagement before moving into its more chaotic sequence. Even André Breton's, poem Objets can be interpreted through this lens of contrasting forces.
So they're using boxing as a symbol of, disruption, of breaking with tradition.
Exactly. The key insight here is how boxing, with its inherent conflict and physicality, resonated with the iconoclastic spirit of these artistic movements.
It's like boxing provided this, visual shorthand for conflict and the breaking of established norms. And we also see this fascination with boxing as a symbol of modernity itself, right?
Absolutely. As American became kind of synonymous with urban and modern, boxing increasingly featured as a symbol of all three.
Interesting.
This would have been unthinkable in the mid-19th century when prize fighting was seen as outdated.
Right.
But